Kia ora kato, no mai haramai. Welcome to In Conversation. Today I'm joined with Becky George, who is a clinical informatician. That's an interesting title for an occupational therapist. I'm sure Becky will tell us more about what that means in a moment or so. She's a doctoral student at the moment, doing a Doctor of Health Science based at AUT, and she's actually looking into leadership within allied health and what that means. So welcome, kia ora, Becky. Thanks for joining us. And I wonder if you could just kick off by giving us a potted history of who you are and where you've come from and where you've ended up.
Kia ora, Andrew. Lovely to be here and lovely to join you. Thank you so much for your invitation. Yeah, well, I trained in the UK at the University of Southampton with a quite a visionary course, really, because we trained occupational therapists and physiotherapists alongside each other and conjointly for the first 2 years of the course. Graduated and went through a series of the settings and systems and sectors around the country. Settled very much in the neurological field, both addressing the chronic disease management of neurological conditions, but also looking specifically at stroke rehab. And also completed a postgraduate diploma in rehabilitation science while I was there. Having met my husband, my Kiwi husband over there, we then moved back here in 2005. And since then, had 3 children and worked in and around Christchurch in a number of roles clinically across community, acute, subacute sectors and outpatient. So really getting to grips with an understanding and immersing myself in the health sector and health system.
So why does an occupational therapist end up in IT? Given all that sort of background you've gone through, which is very solid, I suppose, background of the training and the work that you've been involved in. So what's attractive about IT for an occupational therapist?
Well, to be honest, Andrew, the opportunity arose to look at what it was that I wanted to do. I think many of us as occupational therapists want to make a difference. We're there primarily to support our consumers and our patients and making a difference to their lives in reclaiming that quality of life, or a quality of life that gives them purpose and meaning. And I am incredibly passionate about not proving necessarily, but identifying the value that occupational therapists and our colleagues in allied health bring to the health system and bring to the population. Because I think we are incredibly undervalued. I think we are underprofiled. I think that we are absolutely not great at promoting ourselves either. And when initially it was a project management role came up, I was already thinking about how do I move within this career framework that is incredibly limited in New Zealand to find space to do and make a difference. And so essentially it was a step of faith, stepping outside of clinical OT work to see what would happen. And so it was a project management role looking at data collection and looking specifically at that point around a method of data collection, a smartphone method using an app to see whether I could make a difference in that kind of role. And from there, I had incredible support from line management around actually questioning what that role could do. And from there, over the last, six, nearly 7 years, it has evolved from, actually, we don't need to justify our position. We don't need this data to go into big black hole. How do we now lead the way in promoting data to demonstrate activity, to demonstrate value, to look at outcomes, to then morphing from data to actually how are allied health engaging in digital health? How are we and can we lead the way in using devices, using apps, using therapeutic methods for with digital solutions? So
Is this Canterbury DHB you're working for? Is this the basis? Yeah,
yep.
the base.
Yep. So that's where I have been over the last sort of 6-7 years. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, right. Okay. Just backtracking a little bit, I was very interested in your comment about how occupational therapy doesn't come on the radar. I think you used the term that, we don't promote ourselves. It's very low profile. Well, why is that, do you think? Why?
It's hard to pinpoint that. I mean, I'm sure there's a huge amount of scope for research in that area too. But I think often, I think it's the type of people that engage with occupational therapy. We tend to be incredibly creative and problem-solving oriented. So I think it's almost a get on with it attitude. We get stuck in, we get on with it. And often I think what we need to do is lift our heads up and have a look around. And that's been a big part of my driver into my doctoral studies really, is actually how do we enable our occupational therapy colleagues to lift up their heads, to have a look around, to share, and to go, actually, you know what, these small details matter because they are case evidence and consumer evidence of what it is, the value and the outcomes that are happening. And I think we forget that very much as clinicians.
Yes.
I've certainly been on a journey to realize that our government organizations, our ministry, our health provider organizations are constantly searching for those clinical examples. And we have bucketfuls. And yet it's we need leaders, I think, and certainly people in the space to connect those two together.
Yeah, so the data collection you referred to, it seems to say it's allied health. Is occupational therapy appearing in that data?
Absolutely.
I'm interested in, if it is appearing in that data, is it evidencing the worth, for want of a better phrase, of occupational therapy?
That's a fantastic question. What does worth mean, and how do we demonstrate value and worth? So there's two sides to that. I believe that data has been, I've been collecting data since I graduated. You tick a box, you put the number of minutes in, and it's been a justification. And I think historically, organizations required allied health professions, and only allied health professions, to fill out those data boxes and data sheets and stats every week, every day, because they needed to know what we were doing, because they didn't understand us. And I think I've really challenged that over the last few years, I believe, in the sense that we're employed. We have hundreds of years between us all of justification of why we exist, and the profession and the consolidation of and underpinning of our councils and our associations and our evidence base now in research. So actually we exist. So now let's look forward and go, this is what we're doing, and then look at the transition into outcomes. So yes, we need to acknowledge what the activity is that we're doing, but we need to evidence outcomes and the value that we're providing and the difference that we're making to both system, but particularly patient. Because our organizations, their measures of success are based on system measures and system data. And that's not going to cut it forever. And they are recognizing that, and they need to know that actually patient outcomes and sustaining our patients at home, quality of life outcome measures are gaining a real weight, I believe, in our health system measurement.
So you seem to be suggesting that there's a new landscape being created for occupational therapy and the allied professions. And I'm interested from a regulator's perspective, the scope of practice that we have, the competencies that we have, and the code of ethics needs to keep pace with that landscape, so that the education institutions who produce occupational therapists, the curriculum prepares students, graduates, for that landscape. Have we got it right? The competencies and code of ethics, because they were produced in 2015, so they're now 5 years old.
Mm.
How, as a regulator, do we keep in step?
Yes. Well, I think we certainly need to review whether the competencies cross match and validate the modes and methods of how we convey our therapy, how we convey our clinical expertise. And so therefore, because I believe the landscape has changed in modes and methods, we need to ensure that we are supporting our occupational therapy staff to be up to date and contemporary with how that is achieved. So say, for example, and you know, I think we're certainly talking around telehealth, for example, and the emergence of that recently. You know, I think it's really important to ensure that we have competencies around digital literacy. I think that's essential going forward. I think we've taken that quite a bit for granted. And I think what we've done by taking it for granted in terms of assuming people will just educate themselves is that we haven't validated the skills required as part of the scope within occupational therapy. And I think it is now part of that scope. Those practical skills to enable you in delivery is actually all part of managing the competencies.
So I describe you, or you describe yourself as a clinical informatician. It rhymes with magician, doesn't it? But, I'm sure well, I'd like you to explain what that title means. And before you do that, you know, when we think about people in IT, we think that they're techies and they can fix everything from a laptop to a computer and how things work. From a technical perspective, is that you, or is there somebody in the background?
Often it's me, but no, I think that's not what we need to, like you say. I think let's change the face of that now in this conversation. So I sit in that middle space between our clinicians and those techie people who are incredibly technically minded. And I negotiate and I use language that enables both of those parties to talk to each other. Right. So I can remember clearly sitting down around a table one time, actually, for a specific project where I had a couple of physiotherapists looking at the development of something, of a technical project, and I had a couple of technicians. And I literally spent 10 minutes turning from one to another to say, actually, they're saying this. And hang on a minute, no, they mean this. Right. Because it's about the language and the terminology and the understanding. You know, because we are problem solvers and incredibly creative, we often jump to the how. How can we do this? And a lot of a learning that needs to go on is around what we need, because the how is done by the experts in the technical field. But what we need as clinicians is our expertise. Mm-hmm. And I believe sitting in that space is critically important. And we need to retain the credibility of being a clinician in that space. So for me, that's vital. It's maintaining my practicing certificates. It's ensuring that I maintain registration, obviously, with that. It's ensuring that I sustain connection with the health system, immersing myself in what's going on clinically across the country as well as locally and regionally, in order to understand the contemporary issues around occupational therapy and our colleagues in the other professions. So yeah, it's clinical informatics is, for me, the clinical interpretation of anything to do with digital health, information and data. So it's huge.
Yeah, it sounds huge. And I think you need to be a magician to manage it. So tell me this title, an IT informatician. I've never come across that before. So how's that been? Who's invented that and what does it mean?
Yeah, well, I think initially it came out of the US around that. But health informatics has been around for a very long time. And it very much gives one an immediate impression that it's around specifically data and information relating to healthcare services. And so what we're trying to do by establishing both a clinical informatics leadership network that's occurred over the last year and now has 300 plus members. And specifically also the Allied Health Informatics Group. So we have a national Allied Health Informatics Group, which I chair, is about encouraging people, for those who have an interest in, a passion for, even or holding a portfolio or directly employed into that area, that they have a community with which to connect in order to further their education, in order to further their understanding, and to share what's going on. Because digital health is now purveying nearly every aspect of what we do. So where it was emerging, I now believe it's very much pervasive, everywhere, and particularly now with the pandemic, it's right at the forefront.
So this informatics group, and there's an allied health group, is this just DHBs, or does it reach across the whole health and social care networks?
Initially, it was just DHBs. It's governance. So the National Allied Health Informatics Group, we were formed around a need to standardise data collection. So that's where it originally formed, and it led to the completion of the National Allied Health Data Set Standard, which has been endorsed and confirmed by the Ministry of Health. Since then, it's very much morphed into a connection network that looks at different projects, that looks at sharing information, that looks at discussing the very relevant issues at this time, particularly around CCDM and the work that's emerged. CCDM, so Care Capacity Demand Management. Right. So that's come out from the ministry and TAS, and is looking at the collection of information and data around allied health professional activity and how it is managed. So we talk around a range of topics in that national group. It's governed by the National Directors of Allied Health. We work with the Ministry of Health as well, but it is open. I believe it's an inclusive group. So if anyone is interested, I would welcome their membership to that national group.
How often do you meet, and how do you meet?
So we've been meeting telehealth conference for the last, again, 5 years, monthly. And then more recently, prior to the pandemic, we had started meeting via Zoom. So that we are now able to connect visually, which is always nice to put a name to a face to a name. But it enables us, and we regularly get, we've got a membership of over 50, but we regularly getting between 20 and 30 calling in and listening in to what's going on. And we also have a Yammer site platform that allows us to share information and to create working groups that has a common platform to access.
Tell me more about Yammer. Did you say Yammer platform?
Yes.
What's that?
Yammer is a platform a little bit like the Microsoft Teams platform or Google Drive, that allows people to come onto a single site to have a conversation and to also share documents. So it's a common site that allows, again, greater connection.
And so you chair a group of techies, or I shouldn't say that, I suppose, of people. What do they, this may not have crossed your mind, but it crosses my mind. How do you, as an occupational therapist, front up? How can you, an occupational, and this sounds very pejorative, I don't mean it that way, but how can an occupational therapist chair something like that? Do you understand what
Yeah, I do understand. And I think it comes back again to the drive to want to make a difference, to put yourself forward out of your comfort zone. I have personally grown phenomenally over the last sort of 6 to 7 years as a leader, as a project manager, as an organizer, as a networker and a connector. It's been phenomenal. I have explored different leadership styles. I have gone through difficult conversations, difficult scenarios. I have had to manage cross-boundary work. You know, a big part of what I do has been about wearing a number of different hats and how to blend them into one very quirky hat. So I seem to have a hat, I believe, that needs to span across a number of different allied health professions, but then also to encompass nursing and medical perspectives, because at the end of the day, you're often looking for digital solutions that support the consumer and not any one particular profession.
Yeah. They're pretty big empires, aren't they? Medicine and medical and nursing. For, you know, again, I don't mean this in a negative way, but for a little OT to start squirreling away in there, have you found that? Is it? Have you found that OTs are accepted and listened to?
It's interesting that you say that. I think initially I felt very challenged by that. How could a little OT do that? But I think that's often, again, it's how we perceive ourselves. So it's about identity and saying, you know, actually, I'm incredibly proud to be an occupational therapist. I'm incredibly proud because a lot of people get confused by it. So it's a great conversation starter. What do I do? Why do I do it? What is an OT? You know, and I say an OT is an incredibly creative, problem-solving, lateral thinking person. Now, if we start to say what we are by quality and we start to define ourselves by skills and qualities, I think that's far more positive than saying, oh, actually, I sit down with someone and I assess them and I do this, because immediately that puts a box around context. And actually, I think we need to take ourselves out of context, and we actually need to say, these are the skills that make us who we are, which means then, in essence, those are the skills that are transferable to other roles. And I believe that those that are led to want to make a difference and perhaps lead some of those differences can then look back and go, actually, being an occupational therapist has grown and emphasized these qualities and skills to then apply them elsewhere.
It's really interesting. I think occupational therapy is the only health profession that has to explain itself every time. And I'm sure occupational therapists get, you know, fed up of explaining why they exist and what they do. You know, everybody seems to know what a physiotherapist does, or a nurse, or a doctor, or you know, a speech therapist. But occupational therapy, I've found, occupational therapists, I found, have to explain who they are and what they do, and it can be exceedingly tiring to do that day in and day out.
And I think that's true. And I have found myself, I've got probably about 2 or 3 explanations, and I pitch it to the type of person who's asking me. And I will often say to someone who's perhaps of an older generation, well, imagine that you suddenly find you're not able to do something one day. And each day after that, it chips away at your self-confidence, or it chips away at your purpose and meaning of life. With somebody who can come back in and give you that again. Or if it's a younger person and they're, you know, just wanting something off the cuff, and I'll say to them, oh, well, actually, you know, the last time you went to a physiotherapist and you went for a sore shoulder, well, imagine actually you not being able to move that shoulder. So the physiotherapist is going to help you move it, but we're going to work out why you need to move it and what you need to move it for. And so it's kind of actually, you know, looking at those applications for that person that's asking.
Yeah, a glib phrase I've heard before is the physiotherapist will help you to move, but an occupational therapist will show you how to dance.
Absolutely, brilliant.
Okay, let's move on. About, you mentioned the pandemic, and you know, the upsurge that we've seen from a regulator perspective of the use of telehealth. And the profession does seem to have taken to it, you know, very well. I wonder if you've got any observations on that and what that holds for the future of the profession.
Absolutely. I think it's been phenomenal and incredibly encouraging to see the level of engagement. And I think that this has been a time as well where OTs have been looking at their colleagues and looking to themselves and within OT around how they're managing it and how others are managing it. So I've been privileged to be part of a couple of national meetings, both for physiotherapy and occupational therapy, to come together and obviously hear about what's happening. Fee Graham has obviously been putting on those fantastic webinars initially to really encourage and give practical advice, which I think were absolutely key in supporting a number of staff to transition. But it's also, I think, been wonderful to hear stories about how that encouragement has also come through from the consumers. So where we might, in our own inherent bias, assume that our older generations are less keen to engage, we've actually heard some wonderful stories about that. So an 87-year-old I heard was raving and said, oh, why haven't we done this before? It's wonderful. You know, and the OT sharing that then was able, you know, others in her own team professionally felt encouraged that actually this was going to be achievable and far more accessible for some than they assumed it would be. Now, within that, we've also had conversations evolve. So where we might have had the initial apprehension and mild panic of engagement across public and private services, we have also needed to then look to exemplar uses or people who have really demonstrated the quick uptake. And so we've used them. So for example, Catherine Fink, based in Christchurch as well, has done exceedingly well in demonstrating how engagement has been achievable, and was doing that prior to the pandemic, so was able to bring that experience in. We have got conversations happening now around how do we sustain this? And how do we promote consumer choice within this? Because I think that's where allied health hopefully are going to lead the way, is to sort of, I believe we need to take the approach that we are where we are now, and any consideration of a return to way things were needs its own business case. You know, we need to be communicating to our line management, to our team leaders, to our health organisation managers and CEOs, that actually, if they want to turn things off, if they want to revert things back, they need to demonstrate that that's best for service and best for consumer. Because actually what I would like to see happen is, you know, a community OT calling up a patient for their first contact to arrange a time and say, hey, do you want this? You know, my first visit needs to be in person, but then after that, I'm going to offer you a choice, and we will look at whether it's a phone call, a video, or in person again, and we'll take that. And that's a part of the choice now. It's a natural part of the choice. Because for you and I, when we call our GP in the future, I desperately want them to offer those three options. We don't always need to turn up. We need to be able to say, actually, I want to be able to do it this way. You know, let's not go backwards. Let's look at how do we embed this change in practice.
Be interesting to look at the carbon footprint of not going out in your car up into the WOPs and actually doing it by video or telehealth conferencing. I mean, that in itself could be an incentive to, you know, pay.
Absolutely. And there's two aspects to that. The first one being, why on earth would we start asking patients to get in their cars, to travel, to wait, to park, to pay, and attend an appointment for 10 minutes, and it takes an hour and a half to do that, when they could call in from home? And
the purest occupational therapist would say there's nothing like eyeballing somebody and using all the senses when you go and do an assessment. For example, if you're doing a home modification, you know, you can't, you know, the purist would say you can't do that by telehealth.
And you can't. And I would, because actually, in essence, if you can justify the need to do it in person, then that's absolutely fine. But if, for example, it's a follow-up, or it's a review, or you're checking in with somebody, or it's a conversation and you don't need to either, you know, eyeball everything, or even essentially lay your hands on somebody, then just question yourself. And do I need to go in person to do this? Do I need to ask this person to come in for this? Instead of, can we do an alternative method? And should I offer that option first? Yeah, probably should, absolutely. And the second thing there is you talked about rural access. And so equity of access is a massive issue, and it's a big topic of conversation. There's another webinar happening tomorrow lunchtime. I'm going to like that one. As chair of the HINS board at that Health Informatics New Zealand, I'm also supporting and helping with a webinar series that's happening on Thursdays. And tomorrow we've got another panel in conversation that I'm facilitating at 12:30 for an hour. Easy to register, and it's free. And one of the big questions we're tackling tomorrow is equity of access. We need to ensure that it's not just rural populations, it's socioeconomic populations, it's racial and language access as well. So how do we manage all that? And I think often it's looking at how do occupational therapists provide or did provide their service with all of those issues? And how can we creatively look at providing them now with the inclusion of digital health and telehealth?
Thank you, Becky. We're coming to the end of our in conversation, but I'm really impressed by your enthusiasm and energy. You seem to be plugged into the internet permanently. Where do you get your energy from? And do you have any moments of doubts?
Oh gosh, yes. You should have seen me. Yes, absolutely have moments of doubts and vulnerability. And again, I believe that there's a very good movement happening at the moment about sharing vulnerability. I started my doctoral studies at the beginning of this year in distinct trepidation, thinking myself very not unworthy, but certainly questioning my abilities to see it through. And along came the pandemic, and I got gate crashed at home by 3 children and a husband, and my studies had to go on hold for about 4 weeks while I sort of managed them, supported them, looked after them, and it wasn't appropriate, and I certainly didn't have the focus to sit down and study. And so I questioned myself quite heavily about that. I've also had really distinct moments where I've had some challenging situations in this journey over the last 6.5 years, where I have, where my leadership's been challenged, where putting my head above the parapet has put me open to risk and open to opposition. And I've had to deal with those, and they're tough. Yeah, we've got to be honest and share that it's not easy.
Do you have a mentor or supervisor you go to and talk about these things?
Absolutely, I have a wonderful professional supervisor. That's changed over the years. That's fine, and I surround myself with a network of people who I ask to be clearly honest with me. You don't want just yay sayers. You need people around you who are going to, yes, encourage and lift you up, but also give it to you quite clearly. So I have some really good, strong women in my network, and I have some really good men who also give it to me straight, which is fantastic. And I think this is about ensuring that you have a very balanced support network around you to ensure that clinically you're managing, professionally you're managing, and then personally you're managing. How is your growth going within that? So they're not just OTs by any long shot. My professional supervisor is a social worker. So, I firmly believe that you don't, if you choose not to, you don't have to be supervised professionally by the same profession that you are trained in.
Yeah, I would agree. Becky, it's been really interesting. I feel really energized. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. And yeah, we'll see your name in lights, I'm sure, one day, leading the charge on IT and informaticians popping up all over the place. Becky, thank you. Thank you for your time.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ka kite ana. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.